Service to Agriculture Award this year. And looking over the past list, it's gone to some pretty prestigious folks, and this year is no different. This year's Service to Ag winner has a unique background acquired through more than 30 years of service at every level of government. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008, he served in the 111th and through the 113th Congresses. As the 28th Secretary of USDA, he directed 18 agencies, employing 90,000 staff worldwide, managing a $93 billion budget. He served as Governor of Nebraska, excuse me, from 1999 to 2005, led 7 trade missions to 8 countries as governor. Chair of the Governor's Biotechnology Partnership, chair of 25 State Governors Ethanol Coalition, also, of course, elected mayor of Lincoln in 1991, re-elected in 95. Currently serves on the board of directors for Deere & Company, Burlington Capital Group. He's on the board of managers of OSI Group and is on the advisory board of QD Chip. We are proud to present the Nebraska Rural Radio Association's 29th Service to Agriculture Award to Mike Johanns. On the Rural Radio Network, I'm Joe Gangwish, coming to you live from the Holiday Inn Express in Lexington at the 65th annual meeting of the Nebraska Rural Radio Association. We've just awarded this year's Service to Agriculture Award. Now, with a few remarks, I'm pleased to introduce the 29th recipient of the Rural Radio Association's Service to Agriculture Award, former Nebraska Governor, U.S. Ag Secretary, and Senator Mike Johanns.
Thank you very much. Well, Joe, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here with you today. I look out across the crowd and there are so many familiar faces and people who have been a part of our life for many, many years. And we would always say on the campaign trail that the biggest thing about what we would experience when we would go to an event was not necessarily what town we were in or whatever, but it was the people, the great people of Nebraska who just sustained us and encouraged us, and we thank you for that. It has meant so much. I also want to thank the Nebraska Rural Radio Association for the honor. I've said many, many times throughout my career that every day that I get to work on agriculture is a great day for me. And I didn't do this for recognition. I think you know that, but it does mean a lot to be recognized, and I appreciate that. I spoke a little last night at the dinner, and I talked about our background and stuff and some of the fun experiences we've had. I'm going to turn the clock back a little bit to share an experience with you. You see, my first experience with rural radio was when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. I can date myself here. I can remember when we didn't have a TV. It was just the radio. And see, we would all gather around the radio with my father, John. And the one thing that you learned at a very, very early age in the Johanns household is that it was not a good idea to be horsing around during the markets. You learn that right from the start. But what we'd also do is that we would listen to Saturday night boxing. How many in this room can remember Saturday night? Yeah, I see hands going up. And boy, that was a big thing for Dad. And that, of course, predated the radio. It was a great life growing up on that farm, and everything that I have done in my life, I really got the preparation in those 18 years on that dairy farm. So it really is very special to be here and to be recognized. I also want to introduce someone who is with me today, who I think you all know is very, very special to me. I'm going to introduce her today as my Chief of Staff. She's also my Director of Communications. She's my scheduler. She's my Chief Administrative Aide. She is my driver. And like she always says, I'm your biggest fan and your toughest critic. And that's my wife, Stephanie. I'll start out my comments today with a story. Stephanie and I left Nebraska in 2005 to take a job in Washington, D.C., and it happened to be a pretty significant job. It was Secretary of Agriculture. And I'd only been on that job a few weeks when my first major assignment came from the White House. I was to be a part of the team that would put together the necessary votes to get the Central American Free Trade Agreement passed. Now, I don't know if you remember that. It was in the 2005 timeframe, and it was just enormously controversial. And we had people who were very pro-trade, who were in the House and in the Senate, who were indicating that they might not be able to vote for this trade agreement. So I was asked by the president through his people to be a part of that team to make sure that we got the votes. And I have to tell you, when we started out, we weren't even close. In fact, if you went down through the list of House members and senators, it was pretty plain that this was really going to be an uphill battle. Well, we had briefings up on the Hill, and this was occupying virtually all my time. And so kind of in the midst of this, I was asked to do a briefing with some of my colleagues where we would go to the Roosevelt Room, which is the conference room right outside of the Oval Office, and we would give a briefing to the President of the United States as to how things were going. And we each had our own role. And then we were going to leave that, walk across the street to the old executive office building where there was this big conference room and the nation's media would be there. And the president would report on this briefing and make a pitch for the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So we did this. We did the briefing in the Roosevelt Room. And we're walking across the street and there's a whole bunch of steps up to the old executive office building, and I'm walking up there with the president. George Bush is at my side, or I'm at his side, and we're talking about this. And so he says to me, he says, so Mike, how are you doing on this? He said, give it to me straight. What does it look like? And I said, you know, Mr. President, this one is really, really tough. I said, I'm not exactly certain where the votes are going to come from to get this done. And we're about halfway up the steps and he stops, and I stopped because it kind of startled me that he all of a sudden stopped. And I look over and he's looking at me and he said, you know, Mike, he said, I didn't bring you to Washington from Nebraska to have you tell me that we have a tough job, or you have a tough job. He said, we all have a tough job. Now go get those votes. Ladies and gentlemen, it was my first realization that, you know, George, my buddy, he was the President of the United States, and he had certain expectations about what we were going to do. Now, today I can assure you, and you can assure me, that you didn't bring me here today for me to tell you that farmers and ranchers have a tough job. But that's where I start today, because you do. And I'm also going to tell you straight, I think it's going to get tougher as we look in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. Let me talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to start out, if I could, maybe a little bit on a global scale, because we farm for the world. We raise cattle for the world, right? But then I want to bring it down a little more specifically about how we meet some of these world challenges. Well, first place to start is the mouths that we feed in agriculture, because really isn't that what it's about? We produce the food, the fiber, the fuel that goes worldwide. It was mentioned during my introduction that I did 7 trade missions. Do you know I never had anyone come up to me and say, you know, Mike, those trade missions, what a boondoggle. No one ever said that. In fact, in agriculture, very much the opposite. People would come up to me and they'd say, you know what? We really appreciate you representing Nebraska across the world and trying to get sales of the products that we produce. Well, if you look at the whole world population, some things really strike you. First of all, I would point out to you that from the dawn of mankind until the year 1800, 200 and some years ago, during that entire period of time, there was less than 1 billion people on Earth. We didn't get to 1 billion until about 1800. But from 1800 to today, the population has grown to about 7 billion people. So think about that. From the beginning of mankind to 1800, we didn't cross over 1 billion. But today, 215 years later, I tell you that we're at 7 billion people. Now, there are many entities out there that study world population to try to figure out where are we headed here. We're not likely to see that kind of growth, they tell us, but however, they also point out, and these are United Nations statistics, but you could go to other places and find similar statistics. They say that by the year 2100, there will be about 11 billion people. That will be 11 billion mouths to feed. And a very, very good friend of mine, a gentleman by the name of Chuck Grassley from Iowa, senator from Iowa, been in the Senate a very long time, he always says that we are 7 meals away from chaos. And Chuck's point is that don't eat for 7 meals and see where you're at that point in time. The world would be in a state of chaos. So 11 billion mouths to feed by the year 2100. But the statistics, if you start to dig into them even a little deeper, get even more concerning and more complex. 70% of the population in 2050, just about 35 years from now, will be living in cities, 70%. Today, that number's 49%. What's happening out there? It's what's happening in our state, but it's happening on a worldwide basis. Ladies and gentlemen, there are fewer and fewer of you that are feeding the world. But that's not happening just in Nebraska, that's happening on a worldwide basis. Our population is moving to population centers away from the rural area. There will be fewer farmers in those years ahead that will be expected to feed that rising population. And where is the growth occurring? The growth is occurring almost totally in developing countries. What do I mean by that? Africa has become very, very near and dear to my heart through the years. I've been there many, many times. They're doing some remarkable things in Africa, and some parts of Africa are doing quite well. Other parts, not so well. And I've seen them both. Some of the poorest parts of the world are there, and we've stood in the midst of those slums where to describe a house is not to give you an accurate picture of what we're looking at. It's literally a massive dwelling of tens of hundreds of thousands of people living on top of each other, and maybe their roof is 2 or 3 pieces, scraps of tin that they scavenged somewhere and put over their head to keep the rain from falling down upon them. This is where the population growth is going to be occurring in parts of the world that need us the most. And that's a remarkable statement to make. This is going to occur, this population growth, in parts of the world that will need you the most. Now, what's going on with ag land as we think about this population growth? Well, let me offer you again some inside insight into what we're looking at. The Food and Agriculture Organization, an organization that I've worked with through the years, has studied this, and they say that by 2050, again, we're just looking at 35 years, by 2050, we need 60% more food. 60% more food. Think about this. 25% of the world's farmland is degraded for one reason or another. Maybe it's just been farmed so extensively and aggressively for centuries and centuries. No fertilizer, no way to deal with pest population, no way to manage water resources. I remember going, when I was secretary, on a trip to India, and we were out in the rural areas, and I was talking to farmers, very, very small farmers. They would have just a very small plot of land that they would try to grow something to feed their families. And I asked them, I said, tell me about the well where you get your drinking water, the water you cook with, the water that you irrigate with. And to the person, every single farmer would tell me through an interpreter, we dig that well deeper almost every year. What's happening? That water resource is being depleted. I met with the Prime Minister on that trip. You know who he wanted to talk to me about? A guy who grew up not very far from where I grew up on that farm, a guy by the name of Dr. Norman Borlaug. Dr. Norman Borlaug is regarded as the father, the grandfather of the Green Revolution. He said to me, he said, Mr. Secretary, we needed another Dr. Norman Borlaug. He said, we need another green revolution to feed our people. It was an inspiring comment. Now, I will share with you that I got to know Dr. Borlaug when I became secretary. He was in his 90s. And I tell you, I was so excited to meet him when he came to my office at the USDA that literally my hands were shaking and my heart was fluttering. To me, he's a hero. I asked him if he would speak at a big ag conference that the USDA has every year. You know what he said? He got up and spoke to these thousands of people that were assembled there. And here was his message. He said, I believe in all kinds of agriculture. He said, if you like organics, great. But he said, we're not going to feed the world population that way. He said, we need science in agriculture. And I thought that was such a compelling message. We need science in agriculture. Science has been a part of agriculture since literally the beginning of mankind. The other statistic I want to share with you is that it is estimated that 90% of the increase to meet that need, that 60%, 90% is going to have to come from higher yields. I don't think there's a way that we can insert something into the world and blow it up a little bit bigger. It is what it is. The farmland we have is the farmland we have. Now, are there areas where there's going to be expansion? Sure. But there is a cost to that, as we know. So it is estimated that 90% of that food increase will have to come from higher yields. Urbanization is using up cropland. That's a little harder to get your arms around, but the reality is it's happening. We see it happening. Communities are growing larger. We celebrate that. We want our communities to be strong and vibrant and creating jobs and keeping young people at home. But one of the challenges is they need a place to live. They need a new subdivision. They need an area But see, that's happening worldwide. Some of the best farmland is being utilized for urbanization. And then a statistic that is very, very sobering, but I've seen it all over the world, and that is that about 25 to 33% of all food which is produced in the world is lost. It is not consumed. It doesn't survive from farm to table. Many parts of the world, Africa would be a good example. When you grow that crop, you don't get to a point where you get on the interstate and drive into the city. Some of these roads are just barely passable, if you would describe them as a road. Well, consequently, the food tends to be consumed then in the village or in the area right around that farm. And 25 to 33% of that is lost before it is ever consumed. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to tell you is that the pressure's on. American farmers and ranchers are going to be put to the test. You thought we've had tests in the past, and we have, but the test of the future will mean a lot about what our world looks like 35 and 50 and 100 years from now. You know, I so fondly remember that farm that I grew up on. I love this time of year. Stephanie and I drove out yesterday, and I was pointing out all the cropland that was crops just a few weeks ago, and now it's been harvested. And all I can say is, if you're not done harvesting, you better hurry. Snow's coming, but it's still harvest time, and I love it. This time of year, I get that feeling of satisfaction, and I don't know what it is. I guess it's bringing the crop in. And Stephanie asked me, she said, was there ever years where it was hard to bring in the crop? And I said, yeah, about every year. That was about every year. I can remember putting the turkey in, or I didn't, Mom did. She put the turkey in on Thanksgiving, and then we went out and we picked corn. And we put corn in the bin while that turkey was cooking. And then at some point in the afternoon, when it was all done, she'd come in and mix up a gravy and potatoes, and we'd have a feast. And you know, to me, that really was Thanksgiving. And it didn't matter a bit that we were working that day, because our family was together and we were enjoying that day together. And Stephanie makes the best turkey in the world. Thank goodness, because it's just like Mom's turkey. Well, back in those days, you know, if we raised 100 or 120 bushels per acre, that was kind of a bin buster. That was kind of remarkable. I always said my dad's weed management was 3 sons and 3 hoes in his supervision. You know, that's changed. 120 bushels back where I grew up is crop failure now. Something went very, very seriously wrong if that's what you're harvesting. You know, the average USDA yield this year, I think, is 168.8 bushels per acre corn. And we have recorded a corn yield somewhere out there in the United States. I'm sure we could Google it and find out where this occurred last year, 504 bushels per acre. Did you ever think you'd live long enough to hear about that kind of yield? You know, Norman Borlaug was right. I celebrate all of agriculture. I love the big and the small and everything in between. But I also know if we're going to feed this population that I'm talking about, if we don't want famine, if we don't want terrorism arising out of hungry bellies, we better figure out how to feed people on a worldwide basis. So I'm going to mention just a couple of things that I think are important. We do need better genetics and better science. We just need to continue to improve that and pay attention to it and make sure we're doing the right things there. We do need better equipment. I'm on the John Deere board these days, so I could talk a little, but I'm not going to. I'm not here to make that pitch. I'm here to just tell you that the equipment of today is vastly different than that John Deere B and that 4-row planter that I remember so fondly, that my father would go out there and he'd set his sights at the end of the field and he'd plant a perfect corn row. And then we'd drive by it all summer and he'd admire his work. What a wonderful time in my life that was, but you know what? Times have changed. And we need to continue to improve that. We need that smart equipment where we can literally go down the road or go down that row and plant that corn or place that fertilizer or do whatever we're doing to have the best weed management, the best crop production that we can get out of that equipment. But we need a whole host of other things, and this is where I'm going to bring our focus in very close. We need to be smart about our water use. Mark my words, water is the issue not only of today, but of the future. We talked about that at our table, and it's so true. It is just so very, very true. How we manage that and how we produce the genetics, where basically that ear of corn can be grown with the least amount of water necessary, is hugely important for our future. We are way over-regulating agriculture. You joke about the EPA. It was a national holiday at the EPA the day I announced that I was going to not run again. I think they took the whole day off. They had done enough anyway. But honest to goodness, water of the U.S. rule, I don't think they understand. And they would come to hearings and say, you know, Senator, we do understand. We're out there talking to farmers and ranchers, and I would say to them, who are you talking to? Who's celebrating this idea, you know? Now, no farmer and rancher wants to degrade the environment, but this enormous regulatory burden that we're threatening to place, and I could go on and on. In fact, I could get cranked up about that, but we need better trade policy. You know, it's one thing to get a trade agreement done. It's one thing to tell George Bush, look, Mr. President, I'm going to get the votes, and we will get that passed. It's quite another thing to enforce that trade agreement. How many countries close their borders just to protect the agriculture in their country with no scientific basis whatsoever? We need stronger enforcement. It's one thing to pass the agreement. It's quite another thing to enforce it. We need better and more predictable tax policy. Why should you have to be making decisions at the year end of every year trying to figure out if the votes are there in Washington to have a depreciation schedule that you can plan on? Does this make any sense whatsoever? Why can't that be done in a way where you can sit down and say, you know I have this for the next 3 years or 5 years. So I'll make a decision about what I'm going to do based upon that information. The Farm Bill is important, and we need that kind of farm policy. I was proud to be a yes vote on that Farm Bill, not because it's a perfect Farm Bill. I could give you a lot of reasons about that Farm Bill, but the reason why I thought it was so important is it gave 5 years of stability. It sent a message that, look, we're committed for the next 5 years, and here's what it's going to be. And then the final thing I want to mention today, and I'm going to wrap up at that point, is, ladies and gentlemen, we so need to better tell the story of agriculture. We have to tell the story of what agriculture does in the lives of real people. You know, when I was the Ag Secretary, I did these Farm Bill forums all across the country with farm broadcasters. I figured if you can do a good relationship with farm broadcasters in Nebraska, you can do a good relationship everywhere. So I asked them to moderate them. And we literally did one in every state. I did over 20 of them myself. They were absolutely outstanding. But I was walking into one in some southern state. I must admit, I don't remember what state it was, and there was a pickup parked right at the front door. And it had a sticker in the back window of the pickup, and it said, if you ate today, go hug a farmer. And you know what? We need to tell that story. We need to tell the story of the power of agriculture. We need to tell the story that it is agriculture that is going to solve these issues that I laid out in front of you. Well, as I said where I started today, you didn't need to invite Mike Johanns to come out here and tell you that farmers and ranchers have a hard job, but you do have a hard job. And I'm asking a lot of you. But here's what I'm going to say. As long as I can speak, I will promise you that I will do everything I can to tell the story of this remarkable, wonderful, blessed industry. God bless you all. Thank you very much.